As a landlord or tenant in Indiana, it's important to be well-versed in the state's landlord-tenant laws. These laws govern the relationship between both parties to ensure a fair lease agreement. In this video, I'll go over everything you need to know to stay compliant and protect your interests. If at any point you feel like you need some help for a rental case, make sure to contact a lawyer or a real estate manager for legal advice. Is Indiana considered a landlord-friendly state? As of today, Indiana is considered a landlord-friendly state. This is because there is much more liberty for landlords regarding the entry to the premises, rent control policies, and others. Having this freedom allows landlords to be more flexible with their terms in the lease agreement. What should be included in a rental agreement in Indiana? Indiana has a slightly different requirement for lease agreements. According to the Indiana Landlord-Tenant law, leases larger than 3 years must be sent in written form. However, it's always recommended to use a written lease for a rental since it can be used as a physical proof of the clauses that the landlord and tenant agreed upon. It's important to note that a rental agreement can be adjusted to fit new clauses or terms to the lease, according to Indiana Landlord-Tenant law. In these cases, the landlord must provide 30 days notice before making any changes to the document. Overall, a lease agreement in Indiana should include a description of the leased property, contact information about the landlord and tenant, cost of rent, conditions for rent payments, security deposit clauses, subleasing if applicable, person responsible for paying utility bills, and additional clauses required by the landlord or Indiana Landlord-Tenant law. What are landlords' rights and responsibilities? Indiana law requires landlords and tenants to acknowledge their rights and responsibilities at the time of signing a lease. Knowing that information can help both parties identify that they can or cannot do during the lease agreement period. Indiana landlords have the right to collect rent promptly, collect security deposits to cover damages that exceed normal wear and tear to the rental unit, and pursue a proper eviction lawsuit if the tenant doesn't comply with the lease terms. Landlords must provide the tenant with a habitable unit that complies with the terms stated in the Indiana Landlord-Tenant law. However, there are some specific appliances that the landlord must give their tenant before they enter the property. These include electrical systems, smoke detectors, sanitary plumbing systems that provide reasonable amounts of hot and cold running water, and air conditioning system. Tenants' rights allow them to request repairs for damages to the unit at any time. The landlord must do these repairs for damages under a reasonable amount of time. This amount of time may be decided between the landlord and tenant since the Indiana Landlord-Tenant law doesn't specify anything regarding the minimum or maximum time. If the landlord can't repair these damages to the premises within notice, they may be exposed to consequences in a court of law. What are tenants' rights and responsibilities? The Indiana Landlord-Tenant laws specify that tenants have the legal right to seek habitable housing without any kind of discrimination against them. Additionally, they have the right to request repairs for any damages that the premises have sustained. If the landlord fails to do these repairs within notice, the tenant may pay for the damages themselves and deduct the cost from the future rent payments. Tenants in Indiana have to follow a fairly simple set of rules from the start to the end of the lease period. Overall, the Indiana Landlord-Tenant laws require tenants to comply with keeping the property clean and in good repair, paying rent on time, making small repairs to the property appliances such as smoke detectors or air conditioning system, not disturbing other tenants and neighbors, and complying with other additional clauses that the landlord may include in the lease. Indiana Landlord-Tenant laws, general clauses. The clauses I'm about to explain are the basis of every rental agreement. If you want to promote a healthy landlord-tenant relationship, you must carefully watch and listen to all of these clauses to avoid any legal disputes. Rent payments. According to the Indiana Landlord-Tenant laws, rent is payable at the beginning of each month unless the landlord states otherwise in the lease. Currently, there are no rent control policies in Indiana, meaning that the landlord can charge any amount they consider appropriate for the rent. Additionally, landlords have the right to raise rent prices as much as they want. However, state law requires them to give at least a 30-day notice to the tenants to comply with the Indiana Landlord-Tenant laws. Tenants have to pay rent on time if they want to comply with the Indiana Landlord-Tenant laws. If the tenant decides to withhold rent without reason, they may be exposed to disputes in a court of law. Late fees. State laws don't explicitly say anything about late fees, meaning that the landlords may choose to charge them to their tenant. The tenant has to pay these fees if their rent goes over the due date. If they decide not to pay them, the landlord may seek alternative action. However, keep in mind that these fees should be charged as a compensation for costs that the landlord has to pay due to the late payment. If the landlord charges fees as punishment, a court of law may not allow it. Grace periods. Landlord-tenant laws in Indiana don't specify a grace period for late rent payments. In that case, landlords can charge late fees as soon as the rent is late. Security deposit. The security deposit is a financial tool that landlords can collect from their tenant to cover expenses after leaving the property. Every landlord must return the security deposit within 45 days of the tenant leaving the property. If the landlord fails to deliver the deposits within 45 days, the tenant could get legal advice from a local lawyer. Security deposit limit. There are no required minimum or maximum amounts for a security deposit, which is why it's assumed that landlords can charge as much as they want, as long as it's reasonable. Security deposit withhold. Landlords can withhold a security deposit to cover unforeseen expenses. If this is the case, the landlord must provide the tenant with an itemized list of deductions. Generally, security deposits are used to cover damages that exceed normal wear and tear. Broken appliances such as air conditioning systems, plumbing, or a smoke detector, and unpaid bills. Security deposit interest and commingling. Landlords don't have to pay interest on deposit. On the other hand, landlords are allowed to commingle the deposit with other assets. However, it's not recommended to mix the deposits with other assets since it can cause confusion. Lease termination and evictions. An Indiana tenant can choose to terminate the rental agreement. They're required by law to notify the landlord with a 30 days notice for a weekly term and a 3 months notice for a monthly term. Additionally, a tenant can send a notice for early termination to their landlord if one of the following conditions apply: active military duty, unacceptable living conditions, domestic violence, breach of lease terms or local housing codes, and early termination clause. On the other hand, landlords can evict their tenants from the rental unit if there is a breach of lease or housing codes, 10-day notice to cure or quit, non-payment of rent, 10-day notice to pay or quit, or criminal activity. The landlord can evict the tenant from the unit immediately. According to the landlord-tenant laws in Indiana, landlords must give at-will tenants with a monthly lease a 30-day notice before they get evicted from the premises. To download your very own lease agreement template for Indiana or see our full guide on the eviction process and laws for Indiana, click the link in the description. Small Claims Court. A small claims court in Indiana can hear rental cases valued up to $6,000. Keep in mind that the small claims court also manages eviction cases. By following the rental laws in Indiana, you're ensuring a much better rental experience for both the tenant and landlord. If you need specific help, don't hesitate to contact a real estate manager or attorney. For additional information, feel free to check out the links in the description. If you found this video of Indiana's landlord-tenant laws informative, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you the latest and greatest information on property management. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check this out.